Hello. Can you all hear me? Awesome. Did everybody have a good lunch? Yeah, everybody's going to fall asleep now. This will be great. No? Okay, cool. We're going to talk about CSS today, and we're specifically going to look at some of the new features that are either upcoming or just put into the browsers. So the way I picked the set that it's not an inclusive set. There's more stuff coming out in CSS all the time. The way I picked what I'm going to present is basically I looked at, does it have at least one browser that has it implemented so that we can play with it? Like, that was one of the criteria that I used because, and I specifically went for ones where you don't have to enable flags because I learned a long time ago, I was just putting flags in on my main developer. I use Chrome, and so I was putting it mainly on my Chrome machine. And then I was getting, QA telling me, well, it might work on your machine, but it doesn't work on anybody else's. And so I learned to have different browsers for different flags. Like, so I have the developer edition for Canary for where I put my flags, and my other one, which is, the standard everyday people has. So I specifically picked ones that don't require flags so that they can be tested without messing up, environments and ending up in that situation. I am Martine Dowden. I am been a front-end developer for basically my entire career. I started out in psychology, moved into code, and then ended up as a UX UI designer developer and mainly focus on CSS and accessibility. So let's get right onto it. Some of the new cool stuff that came out recently is a bunch of new pseudo-classes, is, where, has, and a change to the inth syntax. So let's take a look at those. Is basically takes a list of arguments and allows us to go ahead and check against that list if any of the elements inside of it, or any of the selectors inside of it apply, and if it applies, then the code gets applied. The big difference between is and where is in its specificity. So a quick recap on how specificity actually is calculated is you basically have, and I omitted it in this context, but technically you have a fourth number, which is any styles that are directly applied to the element via a styles element. That would be the fourth number. But basically you have IDs, class, pseudo-class, and attribute, and then elements. You get your three numbers, and basically the biggest number wins. So in this particular case, we can look at the specificity. Just a paragraph tag is just a tag, so it's going to have 001. Content is 010 because it's a class, and then an ID would be 100. Therefore, ID is the most specific thing that we have. Now, with that, what happened, the big difference between is and where is that where, no matter what you have in that list, the specificity for the selector stays 0. So it's super easy to override. So it's a really nice way to get like a base set of styles on a set of elements that is going to be super easy to customize later on for a corner case or whatever else is. Is, on the other hand, whatever the most specific thing in the list is, so in this case it would be the copy, right, is going to end up being what takes how specific that selector is. So it's very easy to end up in a situation where that's going to be very difficult to override because now you're dealing with, a specificity. As soon as you have an ID in there, for example, it's going to be a very high specificity. You're going to have a hard time with writing anything else against it afterwards. So let's look at a practical example. One that I love to use with is and where is to go ahead and set my links, because then I can just go ahead and put a where link or visited and have my list. So this is really convenient when you end up with things like, especially if that selector is going to be in the middle of a set of selectors. So like you say you have maybe my container and then a several list of things inside of that container. Then you're not having to write container A link, container A visited. You can just say container A and then where link visited or whatever else is. So that's a really convenient way to use that, and kind of helps with that repetitiveness in terms of the code, but the output would be very similar. Just to note, at the end of this, I do have a slide that has a QR code with a GitHub repo with all of the code that is presented in the talk, so you can see like the examples as they work. Next. Click, 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 no click, click. Click. Okay, so the support on this, as I said, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today has very limited support. So for each of the concepts, I'll go ahead and show the support. These I pulled yesterday, so they should still be legit. But basically, I pulled all of these off of Can I Use. So that's a very good resource. And you see that for the most part, we're generally okay. You're looking at 91% of the population, so it's pretty safe to start using those depending on your use case. I'm just ignoring IE as part of this conversation because IE's dead. I think we can all agree on that. Yes, sign of life. Yeah, okay. I don't know about y'all, but I celebrated. I mean, legitimately celebrated. All right. Next one is has. So has is really fun because what it allows to do is check for if a descendant or a sibling has a particular selector. So back in, and I'm going to date myself, but that's okay. How many of you remember CSS2? How many of you remember CSS, like when CSS3 came out? What was y'all's favorite feature out of CSS3? For me, it was rounded corners. I don't know. I know it's lame, but it was rounded corners. Anyway, and I remember back then saying very specifically as I was helping or mentoring other developers, you will never be able to select based on a descendant. It'll never happen. Just forget about it. It's never going to happen. Well, I guess I get to eat my words and go find all of those people I've told that to, because it's now we can actually do that. So let's look at a concrete example of this, and I have two examples for this one. And the first one is, and I love to use it for this, is label has required. So if you have a label with a nested input, I can look at the required property and put that little red asterisk that always gets forgotten and it's never consistent because we always forget to put it on, and just programmatically do that so that we can have the little red asterisk before all of our required fields. So that allows me to look at inside of my label if it has a required and then do something about it. What's really cool about this is you can also do it when it comes to sibling relationships. So what if I don't nest my inputs? What if I simply have label input? I can actually put combinators inside of here and inside of my has to say, hey, I'm looking for a label that has a sibling of something with the required property, and then go ahead and ask my asterisk. So we can totally start putting combinators, and for those who are used to SAS, like we don't put the ampersand for saying the self. Like we can just go ahead and just go straight into the combinator. I know this looks kind of weird because we're used to having something before it, but this absolutely works. The downside to has is Firefox. And Firefox still does not support it and does not seem to, it does have a flag. I have yet to make it work. I don't know if the flag is buggy or what in the world is going on with it. I have yet to, even with the flag enabled, get it to work. But basically, if you have to support Firefox, you're still going to have to wait on that one. Where's my bottle of water? Next. All right. The next selector we're going to look at is nth child, which now has the of ability, so this of keyword. What that allows us to do is specifically look for something with a particular attribute to it. So in this case, I'm looking for the second child that has a class of active. So if we look, we have the first one, we have the second, third, and I put it on fifth. So second, third, and fifth have the active attribute. And so if I do an li nth child 2 of active, it's only going to consider the ones with the active class. That's super powerful if you end up with a list of things where you're actually looking for, like if you wanted to do, like first child is first child, but if you're looking for, let's say you have a list of blog posts and you want the first of a specific type. So maybe the first one that has, I don't know, my blog is categorized by technology. So it's like if I wanted to do specifically call out the first CSS one, I could go ahead and look for my first one that has a class of CSS, even if it's not the first one in the list, for example. Any questions so far? Feel free to raise your hands up because it's a lot easier for me to answer the question when the code is up than to go find the slide later. So definitely go ahead and ask. This one's actually fairly well supported. It is still considered experimental in Opera, but we're looking at a pretty decent support on it. So that one's pretty much good to go. Container queries. Who has actually gotten to play with container queries? Who's gotten to play with them in the wild? Yay! Nice. So container queries are basically allow us to consider the size. So there's two types. There's size-based and style-based. We'll talk about style-based in a minute. I'm going to start with the size-based because that one is much better supported at this time. And so basically it allows us to look at the size of a container and determine and set styles accordingly. It's a media query essentially, right? And it works very similarly in terms of what you're going to put in here. It's going to be the same thing that you would put in any kind of media query: your min, your max, and so on and so forth. The thing that you need to do, though, is you have to make sure to define the container. You have to decide what element is going to be container so the browser knows what to listen to, right? And that we're going to do using container type. You can optionally name the container. So if you have multiple containers that need to act differently in different sizes, you can name them. You don't have to. The container type, you can do inline size or block. And so what they've done is they've moved away from the horizontal versus vertical type of language. And so now we're talking about inline versus block, and that has to do with the direction of writing. So if we think about English, for example, where we write from left to right, had to think about that one. When we write from left to right, our inline is going to be your width, and your block is going to be your height, right? In terms of, if you were to say take some of the Asian languages, can write top to bottom, right? In that case, if your language is going from top to bottom, then your inline would actually be your vertical, and your block would be your horizontal. So it's all based on the language direction. Flexbox works that way as well, where flex start versus flex end is all related to your direction. So if you're writing from right to left, it's inverted. It gets a little trippy if it's something paradigm you're not used to. But anywho, so your container size can be inline or can be size. So inline is going to be your horizontal, size is going to be both ways. So how do we apply that? Well, I'm using the example of this list of tags, which I've basically put a grid layout together and just stuck the tags in two different places. And so what I'm looking at is I've set my tag container over here, my div class tags, to being a type inline, so it's going to look at the width, because it's in lorem ipsum, but let's pretend it's English. And it's going to go ahead and, based on the container width, I'm going to go ahead and do a display flex instead of having them vertically stacked. Now, notice that I actually put a div around here. And that's because this being a media query, it needs to have something to select in order to put your styles against. So you can't actually put your styles directly on the container because it's not, the container is what's giving you the query. Now you have to go ahead and select something inside of that container. So it's sometimes in terms of code, like when I first started playing with container queries, I kept on like, why can't I just put a different background color on this or whatever? And it's because it's a media query, right? You still have to put a selector here, and it has to be a child of that container in some way, right? Container queries are, at this point, pretty well supported when it comes to size. Obviously, it depends on how far back your users are. But generally speaking, we're pretty much there. When it comes to style queries, however, that's going to be a different story and very different. So there's currently, the ones that I was able to get to work in at least a browser are the custom property ones, where we actually check for, does the element have a custom property? And you can check it against the property and its value. I think it looks like, based on the specification, we may be able to do it later on like specific a lot more options in terms of what styles we're looking for. But currently, the only one that I was able to get at least a browser to have something on was the custom property one. So let's take a look at how that might work. Over here, we have an example of a list of, I had to take my car to the shop, and so I was like, ooh, let's do little cards about cars at a shop being worked on, right? And so it was like, so we have the ones where the users are waiting for it, it's done, or it's in progress, right? And so based on the fact that in the, I can put a style that tells it, hey, the status is in progress, and then I can query for that and make edits on my style. In this case, I'm changing the color in the icon based on the style being applied to it. This could also be incredibly powerful for things like if you're doing theme-based, especially, especially if you're doing something a little bit more fancy than light and dark mode. If you're skinning an app for maybe white labeling an application where you can have based on the user, what your brand is going to be or something like that. This could be very powerful because then you can just check what that value is and go forth and conquer and have some very specific styles on that. Support. Support, not great. Safari and Firefox are out. So that's a pretty large percentage of your use case at that point. They're looking at globally right now, only about 65% of the population has that. So that's very much a play with, unless you've got the luxury of being told, yeah, the only thing we support is Chrome. Yeah, I've been there. I've had a couple contracts like that, but usually they're internal tools. Where the company says this is an internal tool and the only thing IT supports is X. And that's actually a really fun situation to be in because you get to play with a lot more new toys. Nesting. So who all uses SAS or less or some equivalent? So we're all familiar with, if we've played with those, we know how cool nesting is. Nesting is now coming to CSS. So that'll be super cool. The thing is, though, if nesting is something that you often do in SAS or less, notice that even though in SAS or less this would be redundant, I wouldn't need to actually go ahead and say, I want the self and then, whatever. In the CSS, as far as I can, in CSS nesting, as far as I can tell, you have to put it in. Otherwise, it doesn't know what to do with it. So worth noting that that is definitely a thing. So the above code and the below code are basically the same. As much as I forgot to take that out, you actually don't need a container type in this particular case, unlike the unlike the size container query. I totally just forgot to take it out on the slide in the copy paste. You don't actually have to define the container in this, any kind of container or anything in this case, it just works. Yeah. Any questions? I feel like I'm going really fast. Okay. Here's an example of basically being able to nest all the things. Notice that I was able to, oh, that's why I had the container there. Notice that I can go ahead and nest my media query inside of the nesting as well. That totally works. So in this case, I'm saying, hey, my container, although I still have to define the container. If I'm going to nest a container, I still have to do that. The same rules apply, but I can go ahead and nest media queries. I can nest whatever I want inside of my nesting. So that works very similar to SAS or less in that regard, except for that whole you have to have the ampersand. Does that make sense to everybody? Clear as mud? Yes. Okay. Support, Firefox. You're going to be hearing this a lot. I used to like, but at least it is on the roadmap. It's coming. So there's at least hope. It's coming. So that'll be cool. So far, you're looking at about 75% of the population. So back to that whole, it depends on what you are saying you are going to support. Typography. Who here loves typography? Yay. We're going to do some fun stuff. Yes. This one of my, it's one of my pet topics. So the first one is text balance, which basically so there's limitations to text balance. The first one is the number of lines. Like if you put text balance on a huge paragraph, it's not going to work out for you because there's a cap as to how many lines you've got before it's like, yeah, I don't need to balance this. It's a bloody paragraph. I'm moving on. For Chrome, it's 4, or Chromium, it's 4 lines each. But where the cap is browser specific. But basically what it does is you do a text wrap balance. This is without it, this is with it. It's going to take and try to make all of the lines about the same size. Works really great for headers, those sorts of things when you don't have to have that, that one character that's like, because the line's too long and it's hanging on the end, looks kind of ugly. That allows it to not do that. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that it does not prevent really long lines, right? So if you're trying to decrease if you're trying to make it nice and balanced and not take up the full width of the screen, you're still going to have to cap your screen, like the width, right? It's not going to do anything to affect the width, so it's only going to take effect once you start wrapping naturally. Does that make sense? Support is garbage. However, this is one of those that I've gone ahead and started putting it in because it doesn't do anything. It doesn't break anything if you're going to put it. That's the nice thing with a lot of these is it's not going to break anything if you go ahead and put it in. And when it does become available in that browser, it'll just magically start working. So that is one of those that's definitely really good for that because obviously Safari and Firefox are like, nope. So you're only looking about, again, half the population will have access to that. Initial letter. Initial letter, it comes in combination with first letter. And this is really helpful for doing drop caps. Does everybody know what a drop cap is? Yes, no, maybe so. I don't know. All right, it's that first letter that, for those who have ever seen those illuminations, that nice big letter that's at the beginning and super ornate and pretty. Historically, to do that, it was like a game of floats and random, like, I don't know, I have an entire talk that I can pretty much throw away because of this property, which shows exactly how to do the float and the alignments and the change because you're using a different font or whatever. Now it's just like, oh, that's cool. We have this magical property which takes two numbers. It's basically going to take how big do you want the letter, and these are number of lines, so these are going to be integers. You can't do 2.5 lines. It wants an integer. And then the sync, which is where on the alignment, like how many lines up or down you're going to go in terms of the letter. So how this works is this first letter over here, I went ahead and just put one number. So it's because I only put one number, it assumes that it's the same number for both. So it's going to be 3 lines, 1, 2, 3, and a sync of 3. So it's going to head and take the line down three lines so that it's basically in line. I did have to go ahead and give it a little bit of margin because otherwise the text is really, really close, but that's easy enough. The CH property is fairly recent, but it's been around for a little bit. For those who don't know what it is it looks at the width of the 0 for the alphabet that you're using, and that is what its value is. So it's a unit of measure that is relative to specifically to the whatever alphabet you're using and whatever size it is. So it's relative to your current size, alphabet, weight, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really nice in terms of creating margin and padding if you want it to be relative to the size of the text you're currently using. So in this particular case, it's a perfect use case for using CH because it's going to be relative. If I change whatever, this is the default sans serif for Chrome, but if I changed it to something fancy or whatever, it would specifically go for that. But it has the same limitations as EMS, which it's going to go with whatever your current, so if you have two different, let's say I wanted to put a different style on this, if I wanted to put it like a fancy cursive something or another, right, to make it super fancy, then the CH would be relative to that, whatever that current letter is and not the rest. So it's got that same as EMS, right, where it's depending on what you're in. The second one, I went ahead and specified a different line in sync. So it is still 3 tall, but I gave it a sync of 2 so it sticks up, right? Because it's only going down 2 lines. But there you go. But it's line magic. I did try playing with negatives. Negatives does not seem to do anything, so you can't shrink it, and you can't make it go up. But there you go. You're looking for positive integers, essentially. Support is terrible. So the end all be all is there's more to it coming is really the end all be all. And so it's a limited implementation in Chrome. You can get it to work. The example I showed here does work in Chrome. I've not tested it in the others. But basically you're looking at very limited fancy. And I did manage to make it work without any there's no prefixes on this one. Like this exact code will work in Chrome. Outside of that, it's pretty well garbage. Mm-hmm. So it has to do with if you want to change, like it looks like as far as I can tell, and I'd have to reread the specification, it looks like eventually you should be able to actually change the font as part of the whole entire thing so that it can do, instead of okay, the old version before this was basically to take the letter, do first line, first letter, or first to type, first first letter, and then go ahead and change your font, change your size, change your line height, change your style, and change the whatever alphabet for fancy or whatever font you were using for something fancy, and then play around with it and adjust it until it floated, and then play around and adjust it until it looked right, whether you was using margin or position relative or whatever, but basically fiddle with it until it looked right was pretty much the magic. It looks like what they want to be able to do is eventually get the font in there so that we don't end up with those line height issues, because in the construction of a font, the size of the glyph, so the size of the glyph itself and the amount of white space that's included in the size of that glyph, the line height and everything is all defined in the font. So if you have a 12-point font that is, let's say a 12-point font Times New Roman and a 12-point font Comic Sans, if you were to put those two, the same paragraph in both, you'll notice they're not the same size, right? You're not going to have, it's not going to take up the same amount of space. And so that's, I think they're going down that direction of fixing that, but don't quote me on that. I haven't dug too far deep in because, I mean, the support is still ultimate garbage. But it looks really cool. All right. Transform properties. Who here likes animations? Because a lot of this next is going to be about animations. This is super simple and super cool. What we used to have to write as transform yada yada, they're now properties. We can just write the properties, which makes from a pure like functionality perspective, they're exactly the same. They take the same properties. They do the same thing. And they have all of the same, amount, like this whole thing where we take up space versus don't take up space and all that fun stuff. It's all the same as it was before. It's just a change in, both of them still work. They're not deprecating the other one. It's just a different way of writing it that's a little bit more shorthand and for some people a little bit easier to read. But yeah, so that's cool. And the support is actually decent. I know, right? It's pretty much the last time I'm going to say the support. I know, there's one more with good support. One more. Yes?
If I write it in the shorthand, if I go rotate,
yeah.
do I do transition rotate or do I do transition transform?
I think you'd do transition rotate because at that point that's your property, right? Because you're in your transform, you're targeting a specific property. Same with your animate. So animate's a keyframe anyway, but you can totally put these in keyframes. But yeah, it's the property name. So yeah, I would assume it would. But I would assume that if you're going to do that, you have to use it as a property. Like you can't do a transform rotate if you can't use rotate if you're using. You'd have to do transform if you're using the transform, and you'd have to do rotate if you're using the rotate. So yeah, that one actually good support. Scroll-driven animations. Those are super fun. Fair warning, before I put these, I have GIFs. They go on forever. If that's not a thing for you, I apologize. But there is a decent bit of motion on the upcoming slides. All right, so scroll timeline. Scroll timeline is really cool. And these, I have links to the slides that, once we're done. But basically what it allows us to do is look how far something has scrolled and basically add styles and animate things accordingly. So based on how far down the page you've scrolled and based on what that scroll completion is, we can go ahead and make some CSS changes. So super basic example is I have a bunch of text. And this, at the top, I just have, and this is 100% done in CSS. I'm looking at, okay, how far down have you scrolled? And I'm going to show you a progress bar for how far down you've scrolled. And so and then I'm changing the background color, which is totally washed out on this screen. But trust me, we're making a nice little rainbow with the background color. But basically what's happening here is we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a keyframe. Somewhere over here, I have a keyframe. So we have our keyframe that for the progress bar that goes ahead and has its transform. I'm just doing a dumb scale transform from 0 to all the way across, right? And then for the background, I'm just basically, it's my rainbow, right? Just as you go down the list, it's the rainbow. So the animation still works the exact same way as it does before, where you're calling your animation, you put your animation name. In terms of how long it takes, we go with auto, and then I just told it to be linear because it works well for a scroll. Animation timeline, that's the new property. That's telling it, hey, I want you to animate and I want you to use scroll. We can also use view, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides, but that's saying based on the scroll, go ahead and do this. You can name these. You can name what your scroll area is. So this is just being done on the general body, right? But let's say you have a situation where you have your where you've got a layout in a grid, for example, and so your body isn't what's scrolling, and you may have to define where your scroll is. You can go ahead and name that if you want to, and go ahead and name your timeline, which is what, that's where that timeline name is going to be. When you name your timeline, you have to start with 2 dashes. After that, you can name it whatever you want, but it has to start with 2 dashes. So that's a way to basically, based on the scroll and the scroll position, go ahead and change your styles. It can be super convenient for either showing a progress through a document maybe, or if you have some animations as you're showing cards, maybe go through for some repetitiveness, to prevent the repetitiveness. The other option is view. So last time we had scroll, and this time I put view. And I'm saying block, which is my horizontal, right? Because we're assuming we're in English and we're writing in normal English fashion. And you'll notice that it's the same idea, right? You have a keyframe where you have an animation, also that auto, and then we're going to go ahead. But this time we're going to give it a function of view. And so what happens with a function of view is that you'll notice that as much as I'm scrolling, the colors stay the same. Like it's kind of trippy because basically it looks like I have some kind of background and I'm just scrolling squares on it or scrolling white lines on it. But what's happening is that based on the position in the view, the animation is taking place. So this is a great way to be able to do like flip animations as something comes into view, flip and comes out of view, that sort of trickery. But yeah, so that's the big one there. The thing with animations, which I totally violated in this talk because I'm flipping animations all over the place, is be aware of your user's preferences and especially when you're dealing, because a lot of these are based on motion, so a lot of times we animate even more motion into it, right, when we're doing these. So do make sure you're checking for prefers reduced motion, and be kind to people that have prefers reduced motion enabled when you're doing this sort of fancy schmancy stuff. Any questions with that? Oh, and support is pretty well garbage at this point. The cool thing, though, with these is, again, you can put those in, and they will take effect whenever they take effect, right? A lot of these are available with flags, but that's pretty much where we're at this particular point in time in terms of the support. Scroll and view, the individual functions do have slightly different support, so do check those out as well when you're going through stuff. Scroll snap, that's the last one with a lot of support. Scroll snap, it allows for snapping a container. Just so y'all know, scroll snap is really sweet, but if it's done wrong, it makes the UX terrible. So lots of testing with scroll snap because it can prevent you from being able to actually read the full content. Ran into a website that does that not that long ago. Oh, we should probably go through the property. The container needs dimensions because it needs to know what to snap in. So even if you're doing it on body, you need to give it some sort of dimensions. Doing 100% view height is perfectly fine, but it needs to have some understanding of what is my size. Obviously, percentages and variable heights being perfectly fine. There's 2 options, mandatory and proximity. This is where you're going to end up with issues if you have it set to mandatory and whatever content you have is larger than your viewport. It will snap, and it will snap to the next one, and it will snap to the next one, and that bottom part that's not in viewport will never be able to get reached. So that is where you can end up with some issues with mandatory versus proximity, depending on the size of what it is you're snapping. So if you're snapping an image and you know that your image is 80% of your view width by 50% of your width no matter what, then you're perfectly fine, mandatory all day long. But yeah, if you don't know what your size is going to be, proximity is probably a better, safer bet. You can, in this, like if you do a sticky header or something, and you need to, because it'll snap to the top of the container, right? So whatever you're telling it to snap to. So if you need to give that some padding for whatever reason, there's scroll padding. It's scroll padding top, scroll padding left, right, and bottom. I don't think that they have a shorthand for that yet, which is kind of obnoxious. I'd need to double check. But last time I looked, it did not have a shorthand yet. And scroll snap align determines where you're going to snap. So that thing that you're snapping, do you want it to snap in the middle? Do you want it to snap from the top of the thing or at the bottom of the thing? So that's where you can play with where you're snapping and how. Gives you a little bit of fun. So kind of an oversimplified example. I have a container that has paragraphs, or basically, so my, in a grid, my height, obviously the height is really important because otherwise it will not work. And I go ahead and give it my overflow Y so that I can give it the overflow. And so see here I give it the scroll snap type, which takes the direction I want it to snap. So as I'm scrolling in the Y direction, so from top to bottom, and at proximity. So if it gets close enough, go ahead and snap. How close is proximity? Depends on the browser. So that is purely and utterly browser specific. And then I gave it scroll padding top so that it doesn't, otherwise this line would be right there when it scrolls. It would be at the very top of the container to give it some breathing room. But as you can see, as I'm trying to scroll it, it will go ahead and if it can snap and it's close enough, it'll go ahead and snap, but it'll still go ahead and let me read the rest of the content. If I had put mandatory, it would not. Any questions on that? Because that one's super powerful. Yes? That is browser specific, and it depends on if you're using the actual scroll bar or the scroll wheel. There's a lot of factors. If you're clicking and dragging the scroll bar, it'll wait till wherever you stop on the scroll bar, and then if it's close enough, because I'm using proximity here, if it's close enough to snap, it will. If it was mandatory, then it would snap to whatever the closest thing it can snap to would be, yeah. So it depends on, there's a lot of factors there. But generally speaking, it's going to wait till you're done scrolling and then snap once you stop the scroll. Any other questions? Cool. All right. Support's really good, actually. Even, like, that one shocked me. Like seriously? Why? Like, why? But, no, I will have another celebration the day that Can I Use decides they're done even putting it on the list. That'll be like, then it'll be truly, truly dead. But no, support's really good. It obviously works. You're looking at roughly about 95-ish, 94% of the population. And again, it's one of those things, if you put it in and it's not supported, users will get it when they get it. It's one of those where just be careful how you use it and when you, making sure that your content can be read, like it can be really, test carefully with it. Lastly, we have new units. And those are dynamic viewport units. So if we do a dumb view height, which has been around for quite some time, right? 100 view height. The problem is it doesn't take in consideration in mobile those toolbars, right? And so you end up with, historically, the perfect example is dialogues, where you can't get to the bottom of the dialogue because it was based on the view height because the toolbar's in the way. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, I can count. Yay. 6 new units to go ahead and help with that, which is small view height. And each of them have their, height and width, right? So you have small view height, small view width. So that's going to be the smallest available space if you take out any toolbars that may be there, or any OS-specific or system-specific, system-specific stuff. So in this case, or in this example, between these two arrows would be the small view height, right? Because it's the smallest available space anytime those toolbars may or may not appear. That's the thing, even if they're not available, like if it's somebody that has it as auto hide or something, small view height would take that into consideration. Large view height is the largest one that you would have, outside of your toolbar, and dynamic view height, which is my favorite, just figures it out. You don't have to think about it. It's going to basically be whatever height is available at that time. Now, keep in mind this does not include the keyboard. So it does not take in consideration. It does not take into consideration whether the keyboard is visible or not. So it's like it's out. You're not gonna. It's not gonna suddenly change the view height because you have the keyboard out, right? So it's sans keyboard. So the keyboard will still take up the extra space. So you still want to take that into account depending on what you're doing. But these are really super cool because they kind of solve that whole toolbar problem, which has been, I don't know about y'all, but it's been the bane of my existence for quite some time, especially on iOS. So, dumb example, you use it the same way you did view height, you just put a D in front of it. Support's really good. And it's one of those where how you would do a fallback super easy is you would do height 100 view height and hope it works, and then you do your dynamic view height, because if it's not supported, it'll fall back to your view height. And so that's when if you're concerned that not all your users have access to it yet, you can totally do a super easy fallback for and be in fairly good shape, because I don't know, like Opera Mini is actually, like there's a couple of, see how a lot of the browsers that would be Android-y and phony type browsers, phone-related browsers do not have the support yet, so totally still worth having some kind of fallback. So we covered a bunch of stuff. We covered all of that. So pseudo-element is where it has an nth child. Container queries and style queries, nesting, typography, transforms, and a bunch of scroll stuff, and dynamic viewport, and so the new dynamic viewport heights. So, code, where you can find the code samples of all the thing I showed. Yay? Cool. Where you can find blog articles and a bunch of, like my latest book, Tiny CSS Projects, and a bunch of other stuff related to CSS. And any social media links if you all want to stalk me. They're all going to be on there. And I will happily take any questions if you have them. Yes? The style containers, the size ones obviously are for component-driven architecture are great. The size ones, the one use case I can think that is really helpful for those are instances where you don't have control over the HTML, which is kind of rare. But if you're dealing with any kind of content that's coming from a CMS, for example, or that could be generated, or HTML that could be generated by the user. So think like some kind of HTML input type situation, or WYSIWYG type situation. That's the one use case I can think of where, because yes, the first time I looked at them, I was like, yeah, I'm like, you could just use a class. Like, this is overly complicated for no good reason. Just whatever you're using to dynamically generate the property, use the class and call it a day. Yeah, I had the same thought. But the one use case I could see where that would be helpful is when you don't control the HTML for whatever reason, if it's being generated by something, or if it's coming from a CMS or user provided in some way via WYSIWYG or something like that. I could see that being helpful where the containing body would have, you could pass it through a containing body, I suppose. Or that's the one I could see that I could see. But yeah, I'm with you on the. I haven't found it for sure, like hard clad. This cannot be done any other way, for sure. Yes. Yes. I have not heard. I don't know. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Sorry. The question was for the dynamic viewport heights and widths, whether or not there was plans to have a unit that includes the size of the keyboard, and I don't know. honestly. I would assume that eventually because there's enough demand, but I don't know for sure. Yes. Me personally? The question was, do I use, if I personally use SCSS or just plain CSS? And it depends on the project. Generally speaking, I lean towards SCSS simply because, well, nesting was a big reason for years and years. There's still a couple of things like if functions at like each, the ability to do maps that aren't there in CSS that I still use Sass for, but a lot of times what I'll consider is, do I need it and how complicated do I want my build process to be? And that will generally dictate which direction I go. If I'm using, I do a lot in Angular, so since Sass comes out of the box in Angular, I'll just go down, I'll just go ahead and do it because it's there. And definitely make use of that. But it depends on the project. But I tend to lean towards the Sass just because of historically the nesting more than anything. Yes?
But does the nesting works in the same way it does in SAS? I'm thinking like when in SAS you use this ampersand and then dash dash to form like concatenated and have a new selector. Is it the same in CSS?
The question is, in Sass, when you nest and you do the ampersand, it generates a new, essentially generates the CSS non-nested. Is that the same in CSS? So CSS at that point, it would be like it's the native language. There's no recompilation to be done. So like historically, the reason why when you nest in Sass, what it spits out is unnested and goes ahead and gives you your however long tree of list of selectors it needs to have is because CSS did not support nesting. So I could see eventually if the support gets good enough in the browsers, I could see eventually SAS updating their code to go ahead and not bother with that flattening in the nesting. But no, when you're writing the nesting in CSS, there's no compile to be done. It just works. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you very much. You've been awesome. I will be around during the entire conference, so don't hesitate to come say hi, and if you come up with anything else afterwards. Thank you very much.